You're back.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, John. Nice to see you today.
Good to see you, Kate. It's always good to be here.
Yeah, I'm Kate Howe. I'm co-founder of Postcards for Parents. And you?
And I am John Stewart. I'm a clinical psychologist and the clinical director for Postcards for Parents.
Yeah. We're having a summertime conversation. It's a time when this past year, kind of the oddities notwithstanding, kids are usually transitioning from a lot of structure in terms of the school year, the activities, all the after school stuff, to potentially more unstructured time in the summer. And it's a time parents hear more these kind of two words, I'm bored. And for some reason that like strikes fear in our hearts. So that's what we're talking about today. Boredom and unstructured time. So can we start just by telling us a little bit about what's happening with boredom, what it is?
I suspect boredom, and Kate, I want to be clear, I'm not an expert on boredom. I've been bored in my life a few times, and I've watched boredom play out, but it's not something that I know a lot of research on. But I can certainly kind of extrapolate from what I know about development and neurobiological components of who we are. You know, my sense is that boredom is largely associated with a sense of there's an emotional component to it and there's an intellectual component to it. I think the intellectual component is it's kind of not knowing what to do with one's thoughts. Where do I direct them? What do I go towards? What's my purpose here? I think the emotional side of boredom is more it's kind of an experience of emptiness, of feeling a little bit lost. And I think those two things come together to make boredom a pretty uncomfortable state. I think that boredom in little guys can certainly set the stage for mischief, for acting out, for doing things to stir things up, to give their mind some sense of distraction from the not knowing what to do with itself. It gives the emptiness, a sense of emotion. Maybe it's excitement or longing for connection that you're going towards in whatever you're doing. But I think that if we look at boredom as something over the course of development, boredom can be kind of the invitation and the opportunity to take initiative. Because if I'm sitting there and I'm bored and I believe that I have the capacity to not have this feeling, and then I start going, all right, what can I do here that will take me to, well, then I think that boredom is oftentimes the mother of initiative. But I also think boredom, when it feels like the individual doesn't have any agency in it, any way to drive it out, to manage it, well, then I think boredom can become really problematic. I mean, I think it can feel like depression. I think in adolescence, boredom can absolutely set the stage for involvement in substances. And then that's self-reinforcing. If you start smoking pot when you're bored, you won't feel the boredom that will then drive you to initiate some activity that might deliver you from boredom. So boredom can become, or cannabis or alcohol can become, and I think about it more with cannabis than alcohol in reality, but I don't know if that's fully supported, but it can have this pattern of being the way of managing boredom that really kind of puts a damper on initiative. So what is boredom? Boredom is uncomfortable. Boredom, I don't like it. Others don't like it. It is often something that we have some sense of agency. All right, I need to do something so I'm not bored. But sometimes we don't. And when we don't, then boredom becomes kind of a tyrant. There's a sense of just being held down by it. So that's my best shot at it, Kate.
What?
That's my best shot at it.
So I'll just read one definition, which is it's similar to what you've been saying, but it's been defined as the uncomfortable experience of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activities. So, and you mentioned agency and emptiness, and kind of two routes that it can go, like either a way of suppressing it with something else, maybe like marijuana, or maybe screen use or something like that.
Screen use would be the same. I agree.
Yeah. Or and then maybe there's three ways. So there's this suppression, I'm not going to feel it. Then there's the like, I'm going to use this and do something kind of mischievous, I'm going to act out, or I might maybe I'll start my novel that's going to become a blockbuster or something. So do you have any thoughts on like what makes the difference between using boredom productively versus not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that partially, if it goes back to that issue of we're all going to encounter moments of boredom. We're going to encounter it during transitions. Maybe I've been involved in something that was really engaging, and now that's come to a close. And I've got this latency period where I don't really have anything else going on. And maybe for a moment, we're just kind of relaxed, and it's nice to have this responsibility. But then we don't know where to direct our attention. So there may be a moment of kind of that unsettled sense of I should do something. This doesn't feel good to do nothing. And so I think boredom is something that is normative. It certainly happens in the context of those kinds of transitions. I think it can also happen in the context of situations that you get cast into and you're not quite prepared for. You end up in a 12-hour wait in an airport waiting area without a book, or you have something that occurs that you didn't expect and leaves you without some of the resources that you would usually use to occupy your mind and your emotions, so to speak.
And just so that's also an experience of kind of wanting to be somewhere else. So feeling like trapped, like you want something that you can't have, and so you're kind of dissatisfied with the present.
Yeah, I don't have my stuff here that I usually use to make me feel kind of like me, to keep me occupied, and that sort of stuff. So I think that there's situations where it's just normative, and you muddle through it. You start watching people in the airport more carefully, or you go buy a magazine, you do buy a book. I don't know. You find some way to move through that. But I think the people who are most able to do that are generally people who have experienced themselves as having a fair amount of agency in their life in general. I think people who have experienced themselves as really kind of drifting, maybe it's because of some neurocognitive component in their profile, or maybe it's because they grew up in too much chaos or not enough of much of what you need, that they don't have much of a sense of belief in their ability to kind of take things forward. And I think that kids are particularly subject to that. I mean, many kids, if they're accustomed to going to school and then they're doing this and now all of a sudden they've got all this time, they can make a pretty powerful plaintive cry of, I'm bored. I'm bored. I want something to do. And then as parents who are faced with that situation, right? Well, do I figure out something? Do I, invariably the things that parents suggest, kids go, I don't want to do that. Parents will say, you could go clean your room, or you could. That's an empathic miss on the part of a parent. So I think that boredom during those transitions, such as into the summer. I think you'll both hear kids complain about it, you'll see it, and they will sometimes want to go to more addictive kinds of things, such as screen time, older kids towards substances. So I think there are a lot of different variables that determine whether or not somebody is highly prone to boredom. I think some people have more active minds. Meaning that they seem to have a lot of wheels moving at the same time, and so boredom can sometimes be easier for them in that they can shift from one thing to the other. Other folks tend to be a little more linear in the way in which they approach life. They don't have all these balls going at the same time. So I think that I think there are a lot of different variables that probably play a part in individuals or in our propensity to be stuck in boredom.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of set the table a little bit more, like unstructured time kind of has some benefits. So because if it didn't, we would just try to avoid it, right? So but that's not what we're talking about. So let's just kind of set the table with what are some of those benefits.
Yeah, I think that unstructured time, we when we're immersed in structured time with lots of obligations and such, unstructured time looks like the respite. It looks like the vacation. It looks like the way out, and that's so that's absolutely. That's very attractive to us because we're tired of the tyranny of obligation. So we step into the unstructured time, and the benefit is it does allow us to kind of choose what we want to think about. It allows us to maybe get away from listening to the voices and the demands of others that might have been structuring us, and begin to understand and hear that little quieter voice within us. You may get away from work and you'll be bored for a little while, and then you discover, oh my goodness, I used to do watercolors, and start doing watercolors and go, oh, I love painting, and I think unstructured time provides us opportunity to see what direction the wind kind of begins to blow our sails. So I think there are a lot of benefits from unstructured time. I think that if kids are constantly structured, then they become highly dependent on somebody else kind of moving their lives forward, and not maybe even having the chance to learn to listen to what it is that they really want. I work with a lot of young doctors in their last years of training, and one of the things that's interesting, it oftentimes comes up that many of them, because that pathway is academically rigorous, and many of them have put all of their eggs, so much time into the obligations, doing the right internships, doing the right, doing well in all their courses, and they start to reach the end of their training. And it's not unusual to have some of them going, I don't know if I want to do this.
Yeah.
And really haven't had much of an opportunity, or they go out and they do it for them and they go, I don't know, because their time was so structured. So I think that downtime is an important part of figuring out who you are, where your bliss lives lives, as Joseph Campbell would say, whatever metaphor you want, because I think that in the context of structure, there's almost always some metric that's measuring how am I doing in meeting these expectations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When you move out of that, it's a little bit of a judgment-free zone in some ways.
Right.
So it allows you to step away from that. So I think there are all kinds of benefits with unstructured time. I think most of us, I know for myself, it used to be I'd go on a 1-week vacation, and it would take me 5 or 6 days to arrive there emotionally. Mm-hmm. And then I started taking longer vacations, and I realized it still took 5 or 6 days. But once I got there, I really kind of liked it. I then got worried about being able to go back into the demands of structure. So that transition.
Is that also a thing, going back from unstructured to structured time? And yeah, absolutely. If you find your way into being able to listen to that quieter voice in you about what you want to do, or how you want to just practice being. Mm-hmm. You want to go fish and look at the water, or you want to go, you want to go for little hikes, and you want to do things that have less demand within them. And then you go back to having all of these things that are expected of you that we call structure. Mm-hmm. I think it can be difficult. I don't think there's any question. Okay, so I want to return to that in a bit, the kind of like emotional component of it. But how do we as parents support our kids into getting into this unstructured time and kind of getting into that flow?
It's a good question. I think there are a few different things that you do. I do think it's important for you to have some options available for them. You know, they have an art kit. They have, you know, they can go ride their bikes. A few different things that are available for them to go engage in when you know, when they really need to move beyond the boredom. So that's part of it, making certain that they've got things that are available to them. I think one thing not to do when your kid says they're bored is what I alluded to before, which is says you can always clean your room.
Oh no, can't do that.
Well, you can do it. I don't know a parent who doesn't, but it's probably not particularly helpful unless you say, hey, how about we go in together and we clean your room? Because now what you've done is you said, I'm going to lend my support to you managing the boredom and helping you get something done. I have no issue with that, but just kind of an indifferent, it's not taking it very seriously when a kid says he's bored and so we can go clean your room. And it's not horrible. I mean, we do all those kinds of things all the time with our kids, but I do think that when we're able to kind of show up emotionally, to deal with the emotional side of boredom, say, oh, that's hard, isn't it, buddy? I know how I feel like that sometimes. I never quite know what to do with it, but you'll figure it out. You will, so that you actually show up to deal with the kind of emptiness, the little bit lost feeling, the emotional side of it. I think addressing that is not a bad way to activate the child's own process of figuring out what to do. Where oftentimes what we will do is we'll become too involved, perhaps. Other than having things for them to do, we may become too involved in trying to make certain that we manage their boredom for them, which is it doesn't really promote their development of that capacity or that skill. So it's always, you know, it's a fine balance. And you may have one youngster who really needs you to sit down and play a game of checkers with them for 15 minutes. Say, I got 15 minutes. Why don't we do? And you may have another youngster who just needs you to say, you know, yeah, it's hard to be bored, but I bet you always find something. You'll find something. I'll be interested tonight at dinner for you to tell me what you did. How did you, what'd you take yourself into, buddy? So different kids kind of demand different things. It's not always easy for us as parents to know exactly what it is that they demand, but that's kind of our job.
But so what I hear you saying is that often as a parent, we can rush in with like the activity to fill the time. Like, why don't you go ride your bike? Why don't you color? Why don't you can go, you know, set
which
up
is
a play
usually
date.
rejected. It's almost always rejected. Not always, but almost always.
But even one way or another, it's sort of like us dealing with the activity side of it. Whereas what we really need to do is meet them emotionally and then kind of be there with that emptiness or the discomfort.
That's what I think is most effective in helping our kids manage almost any challenge. And boredom is a challenge. It's that not engaged place where we don't really know what to do with ourselves.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about these emotions that come up during boredom, because, you know, I totally agree. It is this emptiness, sort of discomfort, but are there different sources of that? You know, is it just a lack of connection? And if you kind of move in with connection, that'll help them move through, or can there be other things that are at play that kids and people really need to kind of look at a little bit more? And, you know, I'm thinking about the doctors that you mentioned. It's like, if they've spent a whole life structured, I don't know, is it, talk about how to manage the emotions that go along with it.
I mean, I think I think boredom is symptomatic oftentimes of some other things. Certainly boredom is not an unusual symptom of depression, because part of what's happening is with a depressed affect, a depressed state of being, the taking of initiative is kind of the energy is taken out of that. So you're more likely to be just stuck in this place of emptiness, lack of direction. So I think that whenever you see somebody struggling a great deal with boredom, you don't want to completely rule out that they're struggling with a broader issue of depression, which is beyond what we're going to talk about right now, but may require some other ways of thinking about things. I think that there are aspects, once again, of boredom that are not all bad. It's not comfortable, but it is oftentimes in that void of expectation, of structure, that we do begin to hear a quieter voice within us that says, well, maybe I'll go do this. The emotions that come up may ultimately be ones that then give you a little energy and move you forward. But I think that if it is on the lower mood side, not necessarily depression, but lower mood side, I do think that in that vacancy of other distractive variables like an obligation to meet, insecurities are certainly likely to come up. I'm such a loser here. All my friends are at the lake today, or nobody wants to play with me, or I certainly think that it is a time where you can have insecurities come more to the forefront.
And so are those things that you kind of recommend parents helping kids feel, or is that just something that is like only comes up because they weren't otherwise occupied in that moment?
Well, I don't think they only come up because they're otherwise not occupied. I think they come up because they harbor some of those feelings, and we all do. There's nobody who doesn't have some insecurities, who doesn't have some fears about whether they are enough or too much, or however we want to frame that. Some folks, many more than others, largely dependent on their experiential background. Sometimes that's the nature of their relationship with their family. Sometimes it's the nature of it's a reaction to a neurological reality, like a kid who's having a hard time learning to read. That has a kind of, and he sees his peers able to do it. That has a relatively pervasive impact on my fundamental sense of self. So I think that there are, so there's always something, it is making space for something that's there to surface. But I also think that extensive exposure to boredom can kind of take you down the hole further and further, make you feel more and more hopeless about it.
Okay. So in small doses, when you're kind of transitioning from one thing to another, when you have emotional support, it can be helpful. But if it's pervasive, it is both an indication that something else might be wrong and can cause further problems. Is that a good summary?
I think that's a fair thing to say, Kate. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're always looking at it in the context of the moment. I think that, if you've got a youngster who has a very lively neighborhood that they live in, and and now they've moved to a new neighborhood, and there are no kids around, and they're missing their other friends, and they're well, then that situation wouldn't necessarily speak to a depressive mood. It would speak to a situation that you haven't figured out how to manage yet, and probably are going to need some help.
What about, do you see boredom, like, for example, in school? If kids are bored in school, can that be an indication that they are not, either in the right environment or being kind of challenged enough? Kids need to be balanced in terms of like having enough but not too much challenge, right?
One of the things that you'll often hear from parents and teachers, and probably more parents, is that, well, these behavioral issues, whether they are acting out or withdrawal, are because he's so bright and he's not engaged with the learning. The learning is below them. It's not challenging them enough. And I think there's some validity to that. I'm not suggesting that there isn't any validity to that. But I think it's an overly simplistic understanding, because I think that really bright kids who have a nice sense of agency and can kind of look at the world from different angles, can oftentimes go into a situation that's, it's not all that exciting, but they find some way to make it work. Maybe they help the kids around them, or they take something a step beyond. I think when kids are under challenged and they don't have some of the emotional wherewithal to be able to manage that, I do think that it certainly sets the stage for them to just kind of pull back. And this is kind of under the category of self-fulfilling, but I also hear parents say, and sometimes in front of their kids, that, he is very bright, we had this testing done, but he's bored and in school. And that doesn't typically prove to be very helpful. It may give a narrative that makes everybody feel a little better about themselves, but it does not kind of make it this kid's obligation to bring what they have to the task of managing an environment that may not be as stimulating as we want. So I think that it's, I hear that a lot from parents with bright kids, and they're not wrong about that. And they're not wrong that the curriculum may be under challenging, and I think teachers and parents need to be aware of that, and they need to do what they can to stimulate it, to make it more stimulating, more challenging. But you also don't want to get too lost in that, because the child's learning how to manage some of that through finding other things to engage in versus academic achievement or whatever it is that I think that's a part of the learning curve too for kids.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, just both in terms of figuring out how to engage with the environment that they're in, and maybe, as you said, help other kids, or kind of build the relationship side. I can imagine sometimes there's just not maybe the school isn't great or the teacher isn't great. So it, that might be harder, I guess.
I think it is. And I think if you have a teacher who doesn't know how to respond, teachers can sometimes be made to feel a little insecure by really bright kids who are being under challenged. And there are a lot of dynamics there that, as a parent, you're having to kind of read them and sometimes help your kids create coherent narratives, but you never want a coherent narrative that somehow says you've got no responsibility to figure out what the hell to do with the fact that you're bored. Because we want him to take some responsibility for it, because that's how he'll develop some sense of agency in those moments.
Okay, so I have another question about that, which is, a child being bored seems like very hard for parents to tolerate. So what can be going on for us when, either we hear I'm bored from our child, or that, they just seem bored? Like, why does that raise all these alarm bells?
I think that's a good question. I think that we genuinely feel responsible for our kids being happy, and when our kids have something that they express as uncomfortable, we want, we want to be able to help with that. I think that certainly makes sense, but I also think that we can experience as a hook that our child's pulling us in. There's that concept of due attention and undue attention. I think Rudolf Dreikar is the one who talked about this a lot, that children are due a great deal of attention, need a great deal of, but there's attention that they're not due. And if we give them a lot of undue attention, we're really not doing them or ourselves a favor. For one thing, we'll resent it. For second thing, we won't help them develop those competencies that to manage those moments when the attention isn't so readily available. So I think that another variable is that, you and I have talked about, being the parent of young children can be god awful boring. It's just,
Did we say that out loud?
you're so long to have somebody use more than one syllable in their conversation with you, or not have every exchange represent either some failing of yours or some need that's not being met that you've got to address. It's hard, and it's not real intellectually stimulating. It may be emotionally stimulating because you love your kid, and it's not that you don't want to be there, but it's hard. And so I think sometimes it may be that when kids talk about their boredom, and you're sitting there going, "You're bored." You know? I've been sitting in all day on this rainy day with you. I played Legos with you for 2 hours, and now now you want more from me, And I've been managing my boredom through this, and it's not to say that one of the most important things that we do as a parent is the time that we spend with kids. We figure out how to show up, how to be present, how to do all that. But sometimes it's harder than others, and we just have to be gentle with ourselves. And I do think that sometimes when kids talk about that boredom, it can activate some awareness of our own struggle with that, with respect to parenting responsibilities, particularly with younger kids.
Right. And or it can activate a sense of maybe guilt, like, oh, I should be doing more. I should be,
absolutely,
providing this or that. Okay. So, and then also I imagine, so that parents have our own problems tolerating boredom, right? So does it then, sometimes if we see that in our child, like activate those kind of uncomfortable feelings in us?
I think absolutely. I think that one of the things when we look at things like postpartum depression, or we just look at some of the realities associated with the task involved in particularly with younger kids, it can play a part in feeling like the tyranny of obligation can just grind somebody's spirit down. And you get to this place. One of the most common things I hear from young moms when they're really in the thick of it is, I don't know what the hell happened to me. Where did I go? I'm now this creature that functions in service to these little mammals that constantly need me, and that certainly isn't. It's kind of a depression of the loss of the opportunity to enjoy and thrive within the self. So I some of that's just normative. Some of it is, and then there's when parents are in that place when they're kind of bored, and the trigger that the child is offering for them to engage isn't pulling the parent in, and the parent knows that. They know that they should be doing something more than what they are. They know the child's not asking for something that they're not due, but we just can't get ourselves to do it. Well, then we feel guilty. It doesn't feel, we're not the parent we want to be. We're not the person we want to be. So I think
it just layers on top of each other, the kind of boredom, and then the feeling of failure or guilt. Yeah. When you were talking about, young parents particularly kind of losing themselves, it in a way, it's not that different from being stuck in an airport for 10 hours without your stuff. You're trapped and you want to be doing something else and you can't, or it's like being in a classroom where they're talking about something really boring. But so maybe we could just close with when you're stuck in a layover, you don't want to be there. Hopefully, if you're in a classroom, you can kind of tweak that environment a little bit. But as parents, as you said, spending a fair amount of time on the child's terms is what we've chosen. And so what are some strategies to deal with boredom that might come up for parents?
Yeah, well, let's think about that together, Kate. I think that there's no question. This was something that I may have mentioned before, but when I was first in practice and working largely with children, not as much with families, I had a close friend who was a psychologist, a female, who was just really gifted in her work with kids. And I knew that if I was in a lengthy play session where I was trying to do something, I'm not sure what I was trying to do early on in my career. I think I was trying to get through those sessions and be helpful in some way, but it wasn't always clear to me what that was. But I think that what my friend really helped me do is recognize that children are kind of a meditative, they pull you into a meditative state if you let them.
Mm-hmm.
And that meditative state is the here and the now.
Mm-hmm.
And your mind will go, oh, I got to fix dinner. No, I got to come back. I want to be right here. It really is very similar to a meditative practice, that being gentle on yourself when your mind wanders, but come back. The child, just like your breath in meditation, kind of pulls you back. So I think one of the things is just being consciously present as you're engaged with your child, as you're passing time with your child. I mean, I think it's, if we go back to, I love your idea that it's like being locked in or held in an airport for 12 hours. If you really work at it and you're conscious and you slow down and you start bringing yourself to the present and you start watching the people walking in and out and doing, it can pull you into a place where time passes very quickly. Mm-hmm. Where when we're thinking this is not what I want to do, nothing makes time pass more slowly than that. Mm-hmm. So one, get rid of the clock. Don't look at your watch. Get away from your phone when your kid's there. Get away from it, because it will pull you away from being able to give the child what they need, and it'll pull you from being able to be present in a way that it actually fills you up some. Mm-hmm. So I think that, dealing with boredom in those moments, be gentle on yourself. Don't, and I'm saying this, I mean it when I say it, be very careful about letting yourself decide that the answer is to get a glass of wine or to, smoke a joint or whatever your choice might be. Because I think that boredom in parenting, and it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you can find that as a tool that's used, and it's not a good tool because it's very short acting. It leaves the child feeling alone. There's just a lot of reasons why boredom is not a good reason, particularly in dealing with parenting responsibilities, to reach for some sort of anesthesia, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I don't mean to make a big. That doesn't happen that often, but it is
something
is
to
thing.
Mention for sure. Yeah,
it's a thing. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask about the thoughts that's like, oh, I need to cook dinner, I need to put the laundry in, kind of that running list of things that we think we need to be doing instead. And I hear the meditative aspect of being with your child and have experience that it is wonderful kind of when you can get there. Do you think that we tend to have just too many of those kind of, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, or should we kind of, are they not as important as we think they are?
Well, I think you've already answered that, Kate. Yeah. No, they're not, are they? I mean, they're not, but it is the challenge of our lives. If we were another species and, if we were a squirrel getting ready for the winter, we'd be having to stock up nuts, and maybe we'd rather just go sit on a tree and enjoy the sunshine. I mean, I think we're all faced with figuring out how much we have to do. Maybe I didn't need to go that far from humanity, but we're all faced with these obligations associated with our existence, and then trying to figure out which of them are actually more important. Mm-hmm. And then doing what you can to manage that. But I'm not always great at managing all those things myself. So if you figure out how you do that, you let me know.
Well, I just one other thing that works for me. You had said throw away the timer, and I do use the concept of special time with a limit, say 15 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then once that timer is set, I completely engage, and that is helpful for me to know that there's a limit, and also the children seem satisfied after that.
I have no issue with that at all. I think it's when you're just sitting there looking at the clock. When does Dad get home? When do we leave? When does the babysitter come? That's you're in a self-reinforcing kind of state of misery with that.
Well, excellent. So we're not going to do that. We're gonna use parenting to become Zen masters.
There you go. And that's I know when my daughter, who has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, she may listen to it someday, and she'll just come and roll her eyes at me. Yeah, like you did that, Dad. But it's the objective, okay?
Totally.
When we do make it, when we have a cognitive model for it, it is much easier to do. I think about when my friend really got me just begin to think about just being present and shifting to kid time. It really made a difference. It was helpful in many, many ways. So.
And I'm sure that also models that for our kids, which is helpful for them in tolerating boredom.
Absolutely.
Well, those are all my questions for today. So
hopefully we haven't been boring, Kate.
People will just have tuned us out long ago. They'll never know.
All right. Always good to see you. I'll see you next week.
Sounds great. I'll talk to you then. Thanks, John.